Our next speaker, Craig Foster, has authored and co-authored and co-edited 7 books, authored numerous articles, mostly on LDS history. Among his articles are those dealing with crime and culture of violence, including the Butler murder of April 1869, a look at extralegal punishment in Utah, Mormon historical studies, the sensational murder of James R. Hay, and the trial of Peter Mortensen, Utah Historical Quarterly, Myth versus Reality, and the Burt murder and Harvey lynching, Journal of the West, Death to Seducers, and there's more and more and more, and I'm not going to go through them all. But he's certainly eminently qualified for this next topic. So with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Craig Foster.
Okay, I wanted to mention that this presentation today is a portion of the full paper that will be available at the FAIR website. From the time Joseph Smith to the present, there have been those who have accused the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, its leaders and members, of violence. Indeed, they have declared the Church of Jesus Christ to be a violent faith. A character in the Hulu series of Under the Banner of Heaven dramatically proclaimed, "This faith, our faith, breeds dangerous men." And John Krakauer referred to Mormonism as a violent faith. American novelist Wallace Stegner wrote, "To pretend that there were no holy murders in Utah and along the trails to California, that there was no saving of the souls of sinners by the shedding of their blood during the Blood Atonement Revival of 1856, that there were no mysterious disappearances of apostates and offensive Gentiles, is simply bad history." In his voluminous Sunstone article, The Culture of Violence in Joseph Smith's Mormonism, the late D. Michael Quinn argues that despite accusations of Brigham Young's violent nature, quote, "Brigham Young did not originate Mormonism's culture of violence. It had been nurtured by Joseph Smith's revelations, theocracy, and personal behavior before June 1844, end quote. He elaborated, quote, "Joseph Smith's personality and his theocratic teachings were the joint basis for early Mormonism's norms for violent behavior. This resulted in a violent religious subculture within a violent national culture." And Quinn also stated, quote, "Violence against evil became a defensible rationale for both the Smith family and for most early church members," end quote. Such pronouncements and accusations demand an answer to the question of, were the early members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints really a violent religious subculture within a violent national culture, and were they more violent than their religious counterparts? This paper will attempt to answer this important question, looking specifically at indications of a culture of violence among other religious denominations of 19th century United States. So first, American Christianity. Religion and morals espoused by most of the churches in the 19th century America, as well as before that, generally supported, quote, "but that morality indicated violence, incorporated violence. Men of God did not hesitate to use violence, and society followed their lead," end quote. It has been noted that, quote, "with few exceptions in American history, most moments of violence or war have been authored by Christians against other Christians or against religious others." Thus, in certain American regions and among some religious classes, religion and violence were closely intertwined. They symbolized the struggle between good and evil in individuals and in society. For example, among the Black Patch people of Western Kentucky and Tennessee, quote, "they took such teaching as an eye for an eye literally and used them to justify brawling and even vengeance," end quote. Such attitudes also reflected, quote, "emotional Southern religion and the contemporary frontier culture," end quote. The eye for an eye approach to religion and society, expressed by many in different regions of the United States, especially on the frontier, continued the culture of violence. Despite attempts to reform such habits, they appear to have remained throughout the 19th century and even into the 20th century. The Great Awakening's attempt to reform the violent habits of men was significant, but throughout the South, eye gougings and nose bitings continue to be a part of everyday life. Without constant effort and reminders, people backslid into old habits. Despite efforts to change old habits, the manly ways of the backcountry survived the Great Awakening. Such violent habits were expressed against institutions and individuals who violated the community's notions of moral behavior. An example was the hardened Missouri preacher who thrashed a newspaperman with whom he had a problem. He justified his act by quoting Psalms 144, verse 1, "Blessed be the Lord my strength, who teacheth my hands to war and my fingers to fight." This attitude extended to vigilantism and extra-legal punishment, such as the case of the post-Civil War bald knobbers of southwest Missouri. Quote, "This aspect of bald knobber vigilantism grew out of an intensely devout evangelical Christianity that many of the members practiced. The leadership of the Christian county vigilantes included many ministers, lay ministers, and church members who believed that by reforming the morals of their community, they were doing God's work," end quote. These religious leaders were not alone in their extra-legal punishment of real and perceived miscreants. An 1857 Eastern Iowa vigilance movement was presided over by a Reverend Ewald Cooley, and the treasurer was a Reverend A. McDonald, and two ministers were among Socorro, New Mexico's vigilantes. During the heyday of the Ku Klux Klan in both the 19th and 20th centuries, many Southern ministers either condoned or turned a blind eye to the Klan's violent activities. The Ku Klux Klan had a broader appeal to white Protestants. This was particularly the case with evangelicals. Like their 19th century counterparts, Klan members of the 19 teens and 20s embraced Protestant Christianity and a crusade to save America from domestic as well as foreign threats. 20th century Klan members were Quakers, Baptists, Methodists, Church of Christ, Disciples of Christ, and United Brethren, to name only a few. Violence among Christian denominations. While a culture of violence seemed apparent in most Christian denominations, some appear to have been more violent than others. Following are examples of such among specific denominations. We'll start with Baptists. Baptists, particularly Southern Baptists, incorporated a culture of violence that continued throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th century. The first Great Awakening came to the South, and evangelical religion tried to stamp out fighting and violent rituals so common among the backcountry plain folk. Despite efforts to pacify and transform portions of the Baptist population, it was difficult to do so. This wasn't helped when the preachers were at times the problem. For example, Reverend James N. Pace was robbed while on a steamboat. Angered at being robbed, he led a mob with the intent to hang all involved. One man was shot several times. He tried to escape by jumping overboard, but ended up drowning. In Nebraska, a Baptist preacher named Byard was tarred and feathered by a mob that included members of his own congregation because he had beaten his daughter when she informed her mother of the preacher's adulterous relationships with other women. In Gratz, Kentucky, the wife of a prominent Baptist preacher whipped a Methodist preacher for circulating slanderous stories about her. In 1883, in Hartford, Connecticut, the Reverend Everts and Reverend Dr. Parker began fighting. The two preachers beat each other, tore out hair, fell into the font, and tried to drown each other. That same year, the annual camp meeting of Bethel Church in North Carolina was broken up when a large fight broke out between Reverend Edwards and his supporters, and Reverend Jones and his supporters. The less than saintly behavior of some Baptist leaders didn't stop there. As already mentioned, there was a significant Baptist representation among members of the Ku Klux Klan and other vigilante-type groups. Klan membership included Baptist clergy. For example, John S. Ezell, a prominent Baptist minister in Spartan County, South Carolina, joined the Klan, quote, because nearly everybody else in the county belonged to it, and he thought it a good thing, end quote. Ezell was arrested for his Klan activities, and during the trial, he admitted that most of his congregation were Klan members. During the Black Patch Tobacco War of Western Kentucky, the Night Riders were violent vigilantes made up of tobacco farmers. In one incident, a family was attacked. The wife was injured trying to protect her baby, while the husband, quote, bent to the lashes on his bare back, which streamed blood. A highly respected member of the community, a pillar of the Baptist church, applied the stripes. A woman member of the band exclaimed, "This is sweet revenge to me," end quote. One more example dealing with Baptist violence. A rape scandal took place at Baptist-owned and run Baylor University in Waco, Texas, in the late 1890s. In 1895, journalist William Cowper Brand moved to Waco to restart his Iconoclast magazine. Among his favorite targets were Baptists, especially the Baptists at Baylor University. In June 1895, a Waco newspaper published a story about Brazilian native Antonia Teixeira, age 13 to 14, being pregnant. She had been living in the household of Dr. Rufus Burleson, president of Baylor University. She claimed she had been raped several times by H. Steen Morris, brother of Burleson's son-in-law. Brand picked up the story and wrote a series of articles about the developing scandal and its aftermath. Baylor and Baptist officials attacked the reputation of the girl, one calling her a foul prostitute and child harlot, despite the evidence against Morris. A Waco jury failed to convict Morris, and Antonia Teixeira was bought off and moved back to Brazil. After Teixeira left, Brand predicted Baylor would, quote, carefully lock the closet in which it keeps its interesting collection of skeletons, end quote. The scandal resulted in Burleson being forced to resign as Baylor president. However, it didn't stop there. On October 2nd, 1897, William Brand was kidnapped from his office by 4 Baylor students, tied up and taken to campus. A mob of at least 200 students awaited, and Brand was beaten, spat on, threatened with a gun and a hangman's noose, and forced to sign an apology and promise to leave town, which he quickly ignored. Many believe that had 2 Baylor faculty members not intervened, Brand would have dangled from a campus oak tree. The final act in this unfolding melodrama took place on April 1st, 1898. Brand and his business manager were walking to the train station. Real estate developer and Baylor supporter Tom Davis stepped out of his office and shot Brand in the back. The business manager scuffled with Davis while Brand shot Davis several times. Both Brand and Davis died of their wounds. Lutherans. During the 1740s, Lutheran conflict with and violence against Moravians raged from Virginia to New York, but it was most intense in the German and Swedish communities of Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Indeed, the Delaware Valley was a particular hotspot of violence. The Lutheran anti-Moravian conflict became especially violent in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, in late 1745 and early 1746, when about 70 Lutheran families stirred up by their ministers attacked and fought with about 80 pro-Moravian families in a riot that turned into a violent altercation. From that point, both sides resorted to carrying weapons to church services, and similar violent altercations spread to a number of communities in the surrounding area. After years of sometimes violent controversy, the Moravians and Lutherans eventually developed as separate denominations. While inter- and intra-denominational conflict involving Lutherans decreased significantly after that volatile 18th century decade, divisions and discord did occur. In 1837, a riot took place at a Lutheran church in New York City over theological issues and ritual. The conflict was between Lutherans and Calvinists, and a melee occurred around the pulpit with congregants, quote, thrashing each other like loafers at the 5 Points, end quote, in reference to the infamous 5 Points gangs. In 1851, a riot took place between two factions of the Chillicothe, Ohio Lutheran Church, who resorted to fisticuffs. Among those injured was the wife of the pastor, and a man was arrested for assaulting her. Methodists. Methodists were both the recipients and the perpetrators of sectarian and extra-legal violence that included physical confrontations, rioting, jeering, rock-throwing, and even lynching. Indeed, a certain level of violence was not only expected, but at times encouraged among Methodists. Famous frontier Methodist preacher and one of the first two Methodist bishops in America, Francis Asbury, once said, "It is true that Methodists are not a fighting people, but they are not all sanctified. They may be provoked to retaliate, and they are very numerous on this ground," end quote. Historically, there appears to have been a number of Methodists provoked in one way or another. One of the more colorful examples was Eli Farmer, an antebellum Methodist clergyman who not only preached violence but also practiced it. In the mid-1830s, he confronted an antagonistic neighbor and thrashed him. The man continued to verbally abuse Farmer, who finally, quote, caught him by the throat and running him against a fence, choked him till his tongue protruded and he began to beg, end quote. Farmer, another 19th century circuit-riding Methodist clergyman from Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, included many similar boastful and at times gory accounts of their willingness and ability to dish out physical beatings to various antagonists. A Methodist Sunday school superintendent in the Ohio Valley organized a posse to track down a tramp who had stolen a knapsack full of Bibles, and then insisted the man be punished right away rather than going to the trouble of binding him over for a trial. The thief received 39 lashes. Methodist clergyman Peter Cartwright could be combative, even violent. In the course of his circuit-riding duties, the reminiscences of his early career in Tennessee, Kentucky, and Ohio are seemingly little more than a succession of battles with evangelical rivals, of whom Baptists are the principal foe. Cartwright one time told about how some Latter-day Saints had disrupted a camp meeting over which he presided. He ordered them out, yelling, "Don't show your face here again, nor one of the Mormons. If you do, you will get Lynch's law." In short, the preacher threatened to kill any saints who dared to show their faces at a Methodist meeting. Like other religious denominations, Methodists also fought amongst themselves. In Fannin County, Texas, in 1859, members of the Methodist Episcopal Church North were ordered to leave conference by 50 members of the Methodist Episcopal Church South. They were threatened to have Lynch law applied to them if they did not leave. For some Methodists, including religious leaders, acts of violence extended beyond simple fighting, whipping, and even rioting. In Virginia, a Methodist preacher named R.S. Bigham was assaulted by 3 men he had ejected from a previous church meeting. He pulled a pistol, shot 1 man, but the other 2 escaped. A year later, in Greene County, Missouri, Reverend John Calvin shot and killed William Hurdick, a deacon in his congregation, and shot and wounded Hurdick's brother-in-law. Hurdick suspected the minister of committing adultery with Hurdick's wife. Hurdick attacked his minister with a knife, and Calvin responded by firing his pistol. In another deadly incident, the Reverend B. Jenkins of Mansfield, Louisiana, having, it is said, reason to believe that the Reverend J. Dane Bowden, president of Mansfield College, had seduced a young lady friend of his. He shot Bowden on sight, putting 6 bullets in his body. Both were ministers of the Methodist Episcopal Church. Now Presbyterians. Historically, Ulster Scots Presbyterians, known in America as the Scotch-Irish, settled on the frontier fringes of society. In this frontier setting, they dealt with Native Americans, and in Pennsylvania, many Scotch-Irish felt they were not receiving the protection they needed being on the frontier. In late 1763, the Scotch-Irish Presbyterian Paxton Boys, as they called themselves, massacred a group of Christian Susquehannock Indians near Lancaster. Nearly 24 were killed in the attack. A larger group of Paxton Boys marched on Philadelphia in early 1764 with the aim of killing the Moravian, Lenape, and Mohican Indians who had been moved to Philadelphia for their protection. The Paxton Boys and their Presbyterian supporters were accused of targeting not only Americans, but also whites, specifically English Quakers and German Moravians, believed by Scotch-Irish settlers to threaten the safety of the backcountry. While the incident was resolved, animosity between Presbyterians in Pennsylvania against Quakers and Anglicans continued for some time. In Reconstruction, South Carolina, quote, leaders of the Bethesda Presbyterian Church in York County, an area of heavy Klan violence, voiced exasperation, not at the Ku Klux Klan and violence, but over federal intervention and mass arrests, end quote. Now, Catholics. Anti-Catholicism has deep roots in American history. Catholics have traditionally been one of the most persecuted religious groups in America. The antebellum northeastern states experienced anti-Catholic riots and convent burnings. These riots were over concerns about Catholics' allegiance to the Pope, with fears expressed about popish plots to control America. One of the better-known cases of rioting and convent burning was the burning of the Ursuline Convent in Charlestown, Massachusetts in 1834, which took place before the publication of 2 popular anti-Catholic works published in 1835. Rebecca Reed's 6 Months in a Convent and Maria Monk's Awful Disclosures of the Hotel Dieu. The burning of the convent actually encouraged the publication of such escape exposés as the 2 mentioned works. There were anti-Catholic riots, one in New York in 1841, 2 in Philadelphia in 1844, 1 in Boston in 1834, and the anti-Catholic feeling was behind Cincinnati's Bedini riot of 1853. These anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic riots of 1844 caused violence against Irish residents and resulted in 2 burnt Catholic churches in Philadelphia. Despite this history of persecution, Catholics appear to have been able to give as well as they received. The 1842 Lombard Street riot happened when quote, more than 1,000 members of the Black Young Men's Vigilant Association took part in a temperance parade to commemorate the 8th anniversary of the abolition of slavery in the West Indies, and were attacked by an Irish Catholic mob, end quote. The riot, caused in part by social and economic competition of the growing black population, caused serious damage, including the burning of the African Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia. In 1852, a Catholic mob broke up the Baltimore lecture of the Reverend Mr. Leahy, who claimed to be an ex-monk. The following evening, the Catholic mob again tried to break up the lecture, but were thwarted this time in their efforts. More Catholic mobbing was threatened in 1871, Newark, New Jersey, when a Baptist minister baptized a Catholic girl. In the mid-1890s, a husband and wife named Joseph and Mary Elizabeth Slattery, claimed to be a former priest and nun, gave a series of anti-Catholic lectures. In October 1893 in St. Louis, Missouri, they were accosted by a mob of Catholics who were yelling, "Lynch him and teach him a lesson." Police had to be called to protect the couple. In San Francisco, a mob of 10,000 gathered where the couple was lecturing. They were crying, "Lynch him, hang him, kill him." But the couple again were protected. Probably the most violent protest against the Slatterys took place in February 1895 in Savannah, Georgia, where they were lecturing. A mob of 3,000 to 5,000, most of them Catholics, surrounded the lecture hall and began making threats while throwing bricks, rocks, and other projectiles. Those attending the lecture were unable to exit the building for fear of being attacked. Eventually, 11 military companies had to be called out to disperse the mob. While there are certainly examples of violence among Christian denominations, the question still must be asked, was there a strain of violence within 19th century Latter-day Saint culture as violent as, and perhaps more so, than that of most Americans around them? Critics of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints point to a few well-known acts of extra-legal violence as evidence of a culture of violence that permeated the early church. Critics and naysayers point to certain examples and events to push their argument of a violent religious subculture within a violent national culture. Naturally, the Mountain Meadows Massacre is usually the first mentioned, followed by accusations of blood atonement and extra-legal justice as examples of a Mormon penchant for violence. The Mountain Meadows Massacre was an unbelievably horrible tragedy that took place under extraordinary circumstances and was generally an anomaly in Mormon history. But what of accusations of blood atonement, as well as known acts of vigilante, extra-legal violence that included lynchings, shootings, and even a couple of cases of castration? Where did such incidents place within the greater historical and social context of the time? As stated above, the quote, "The fact of American violence is that time and again it has been the instrument not merely of the criminal and disorderly, but of the most upright and honorable," end quote. This is because traditionally Americans, quote, "Americans have never been loath to employ the most unremitting violence in the interest of any cause deemed a good one," end quote. Such was the case not only for various religious denominations, but the United States as a whole. The states and territories surrounding Utah experienced differing levels of vigilantism and extra-legal violence. Vigilantism was rampant in Nevada mining towns from Virginia City to Pioche. Montana was a significant vigilante state. The 1884 vigilante movement in northern and eastern Montana against horse and cattle thieves claimed 35 victims and was the bloodiest in all American vigilante movements. Texas had 52 vigilante groups, more than any other state. quote, there were dozens and dozens of vigilante movements in most of the other western states. Only Oregon and Utah did not have significant vigilante activity, end quote. A historian noted, quote, violence in America has long manifested this uneven quality of levels of violence. Some regions, such as the South and the frontier and urban ghettos, have experienced very high levels of violence and disorder, while others, such as rural New England or Mormon Utah, have been far more tranquil places, end quote. The lack of extra-legal violence in Utah compared to other territories is impressive, as such incidents, quote, were very rare compared to elsewhere in the West, where no concerted effort to undermine a popularly supported government was going on, as in Utah, by the federal government versus the Mormons, end quote. Nevertheless, we do need to affirm that Utah was far from devoid of violence, both legal and extra-legal. But most of Utah's violence took place on the fringe of frontier society. Quote, lawless violence on the frontiers of the Mormon kingdom was predictable as strangers and outlaws converged in the unordered periphery of civilization. Unlike the territorial frontiers, the heart of the Utah Territory was a society founded and established on law, with communities full of individuals that interacted on a daily basis, end quote. Still, both critics and members of the Church of Jesus Christ have pointed to Brigham Young's teachings about blood atonement as an example of Mormon violence. Brigham Young and other leaders preached about how some sins, like murder and adultery, were so grievous that they could only atone for them by the spilling of blood. In one speech, Young said, quote, any of you who understand the principles of eternity, if you have sinned a sin requiring the shedding of blood, except the sin unto death, would not be satisfied nor rest until your blood should be spilled, end quote. While this language appears shocking to 21st century ears, the 19th century style of preaching was known for being fiery and often filled with violent rhetoric. Paul H. Peterson referred to Brigham Young's blood atonement teachings as rhetorical devices. And Ronald W. Walker argued that Brigham Young and early church leaders used harsh language that was like having it raining pitchforks tines downwards, and the sermons akin to peals of thunder, but more as rhetorical devices to encourage saints to repent rather than as a carte blanche to commit blood atonement or other forms of holy violence. In terms of blood atonement and holy violence, historians have found that, quote, there was little bite accompanying Young's celebrated bark, end quote. For, quote, herein was the true nature of blood atonement, to allow men to realize the gravity of their sinful ways and rechart a course towards salvation through good works, end quote. Thus, Brigham Young repeatedly told penitent sinners, including adulterers and others who had committed grievous sins, to not seek to have their blood shed, but to simply repent and do better. Despite Young's and others' forgiving approach to penitent sinners, as well as the fact that actual blood atonement killings were extremely rare and even harder to substantiate, stories abounded of blood atonement killings throughout Utah. Many people spoke in generalities, but were unable to actually provide evidence of blood atonement murders. Lack of evidence notwithstanding, warnings of holy murders and people not being safe in Utah continued. The reality is most extra-legal violence in Utah did not revolve around, nor was it dependent upon, the idea of blood atonement. The evidence clearly indicates that the majority of these incidents were the direct result of vigilante-style justice. It has been claimed that quote, it would be bad history to pretend that there were no holy murders in Utah. it is equally deficient to allow an extremely misunderstood doctrine to distort the past of an entire people and region, end quote. And it has already been shown that vigilante extralegal violence in Utah was at a much lower rate than surrounding places. As Thomas G. Alexander explained, quote, "The available evidence shows, however, that beyond a few well-publicized murders, we have every right to believe that compared with surrounding territories, Utah was a relatively murder and violence-free community. In fact, barring further evidence to the contrary, the best evidence we have at this point is that Utah was one of the least violent jurisdictions in the western United States," end quote. The purpose of this paper has not been to cast aspersions upon the named denominations nor its members, nor is it to justify incidents of violence among and by early members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The purpose of this paper is to answer the question of whether or not the LDS Church and its members really were a violent religious subculture within a violent national culture and were even more violent than their religious counterparts. When looking at the larger picture, the answer to the question is that it's obvious the Church of Jesus Christ and its members were not more violent than their religious counterparts. For that matter, in most cases, it appears they were less violent than some members of other religious denominations, as demonstrated with the examples given. The reality is, as historian Patrick Hugh Mason explains, quote, "All religious traditions have within them multiple and often conflicting resources such as scripture, rituals, leadership structures, and cosmologies that lead some religious actors to choose the path of violence, while others seek justice through nonviolent means and work for reconciliation among combatants," end quote. Furthermore, when dealing with humans and humanity, inevitably there will be a mix of everything in terms of action and reaction. Because of human nature, we need to recognize the tragic elements within every religious community's past. Despite moments of difficulty and even certain levels of antisocial behavior or violence, it's difficult and even a bit ridiculous to judge and condemn a whole religious movement for the actions of a few individuals or even small groups within that organization or denomination. Thank you.
So, thank you, Craig. That was really interesting. I think it's interesting that the church tends to be portrayed as violent, or it's always tied to violence. Why do you think that is? What do you think that? What's the motivation to tie us to that particular thing?
Well, I think one of the motivations is to, if they are able to portray the church, especially the early church, as being these religious, crazed radicals, then it calls into question the veracity of the gospel message. And if they're able to portray Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and some of the other leaders as being violent, then it doubly calls into question the veracity of the gospel message.
Puts us in a non-Christian category then.
Right, exactly. We become one of the others.
Got it. Here's a question we have. Would you likely attribute the violence cited as not necessarily endemic to the sects noted in your remarks? So I think what they're saying is you listed a number of violent acts by various other denominations, but you would agree that the same thing for us holds true with them as we...
Absolutely. Absolutely. I wanted to give examples from other denominations to show that we need to put it within the greater historical and social context. And so that wasn't to make the other denominations look bad. The reality is humans are going to be humans. And we have a very violent culture today, but we have a culture that doesn't accept violence as much as the earlier culture did. In other words, we have a violent culture. We have it on TV. We have it in movies everywhere. But we still are able, for the most part, to say, that's bad, that's wrong. Back in the 18th and 19th centuries, it was almost expected. In fact, I've argued in other articles dealing with culture of violence that in many ways it was not only accepted, it was expected that should someone feel that they were insulted or whatever, that they would attack them physically, violently. And nowadays, we hopefully don't have that attitude as much.
I think also we have we had a society back then in the 1800s where we did not have, and we always see the sheriff in town and things, but a lot of communities didn't really have that. And so people used extra legal methods to maintain peace, as they put it.
Exactly. And I have in the Fuller article, I mentioned the fact that vigilante groups included everyone, basically. You would have, shop owners, bank owners, I mean, you name it. So there's a phrase that I'm going to slaughter here, but it's a famous phrase by the hands of basically by the hands of upstanding individuals. In other words, when these vigilante acts took place, it was some of the finest people in the community who did the vigilante acts or encouraged them. So that was their way of trying to have a type of law and order if they felt that the actual law was not doing the job or they weren't present.
And I know that you've spoken out before about this subject many times, including you spoke out quite strongly when the Under the Banner of Heaven series came out. Yeah.
Yes, because once again, both Krakauer and then especially this series, I thought Krakauer was bad, but my heavens, the series, they tried to drum up every imaginable thing. And if you pull something out of historical and social context, you can paint a person or a group of people any way that you want. Mm-hmm. And in both Krakauer and Under the Banner of Heaven series did that.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
Just a reminder to people, if you want us to continue providing programs like this, please make a donation to us. In addition, we're going to have a quick break, and our next speaker will be at 2:50 Mountain Time.